By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood, and fired the shot, heard round the world. The foe long since in silence slept, alike the conqueror silent sleeps, and time the ruined bridge has swept, down the dark stream, which seaward creeps. On this green bank, by this soft stream, we set today a votive stone, that memory may their deed redeem, when like our sires, our sons are gone. Spirit that made those heroes dare to die and leave their children free, bid time and nature gently spare the shaft we raise to them and thee.
The History Things podcast is brought to you by TR Historical, your one-stop shop for all your historical fan gear needs. Visit trhistorical.com and use the promo code HISTORYTHINGS to receive 10% off your next purchase. Thanks for listening. Now let's start the show.
Are you ready?
Hey everybody, welcome back to the History Things podcast, sponsored by TR Historical, your one-stop shop for all your historical fan gear needs. Shop trhistorical.com and use the promo code HISTORYTHINGS to get your 10% off your next purchase. Now, I'm your host, Matt Borders, and joining me today, as ever, is my co-host, storyteller, musician, and history wildman, Pat McGuire. Pat, how's it going there, buddy?
It's going fantastic, Matt. I am really excited. We have made it to quarter 2 of season 3. You know, we're chugging right along, and we're going to get into a topic today that I have been wanting to talk about for an extremely Longfellow time.
Really?
Yeah, right out of the gate, buddy. No, I do love the entire subject matter of the war we're going to talk about, but specifically the beginning of it is something that I don't get to focus on a ton. So I'm really excited for today's episode. So Matt, who are we hanging out with today?
Our guest today, folks, is going to be the curator of the Concord Museum, David Wood. So, David, thank you very much for joining us here this morning on the History Things podcast.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Happy
Absolutely.
to be here.
Tell us a little bit about the Concord Museum before we get into what our subject matter is today, real quick here, but just about, sort of what you do and all the special stuff you teach up there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the museum was founded in 1886. But was actually formed around a collection that had already been assembled by an individual, Cummings Davis. So it's a collection that was begun around 1850. And there's a certain set of virtues to that. Nobody else was collecting at the time. The stuff was around. Davis collected locally. He collected things with histories, and that was the beginning of the institution now. So we've changed a good deal over the century and a quarter and more, but the mission is still the same.
David, was the collection developed specifically with the Revolutionary War in mind, or was it more of the preserving the colonial era itself?
It's a little tough to say. Davis was not especially educated and really had no means. So it's a little tough to account for where did he get the idea, why was he so good at it, because he collected some wonderful things. One of his friends was Henry Thoreau, and Thoreau took a remarkably active modern view of what we would now call material culture history. So I think that Davis may very well have been influenced by Thoreau in some of that. But as I say, it's difficult to account for. The April 19th was definitely a focus from the beginning, but not exclusively. But the events at the bridge changed the way Concord thought about itself permanently. So Davis is kind of operating on that field to begin with.
Well, that's a perfect segue to get into what we are talking about today. So, ladies and gentlemen, buckle your seatbelts because we are going to take our first dips into the story of the American Revolution. And we're, like every good storyteller, we're going to start right where you should, right at it's not the real beginning. So if you're about to hit me with a nuance argument in the comments, just chill. I know there's more to this story than just what happens at Lexington and Concord, but that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're really, really pumped to get into this story. So David, locally to us, we have a site called Fort Frederick State Park. It's a French and Indian war fort. It has a Revolutionary War story and things like that, but it's my first connection to the pre-Revolutionary War story, sort of how we got to the shot heard round the world. So can you, we don't need to talk about Fort Frederick. Gosh, Rob. No, shout out to our good buddy Rob, who's the ranger out there. He was a guest on our show and a good friend of ours. But how do we get from sort of let's say the French and Indian War era to the shot heard round the world without stopping at every single moment in time along the way?
Right. In a lot of ways, and again, every single one of these points can be argued, but in a lot of ways, the debt from the 7 Years' War can certainly be pointed to as the factor here. It goes back a bit beyond that. In other words, the rhetoric of the decade before the Revolution focused a good deal on the War of Spanish Succession because of the debt that war left, and then the weird economic things that England tried to do to offset that debt were seen as tyrannical. They really were arbitrary. It was ministers gone mad. And so that's really the tone of the complaint is, now we love the king, but he's surrounded by bad ministers. This is an old story, but it's definitely the one they're sticking to.
The War of Spanish Succession. I'm a huge golden age of piracy guy. That's the same conflict that sort of allows that moment in the sun on the seas to flourish, correct? The War of Spanish Succession, we're talking the early 1700s?
Yes, concluded. Well, the economic mop-up was from the 1720s, but it included, the part of the settlement with Spain allowed English commercial access to part of the Mosquito Coast and that's where England started getting involved in the slave trade. That having that little toe on the beach there was something that England exploited shamelessly, and that's the era of the golden age of the pirates. I think that's safe to say. Although, of course, that stuff goes back to the 1580s, but Spain may be said to have made a mistake allowing England any toehold on the coast of South America. So that's where they are, and that's where they are in 1763 again. War's over, huge debt. How do we pay off this debt? And the ministers, ministers are a sort of not parliament, not king. They were the target for a lot of the invective coming from the colonies, and because and it underlies this concern about, well, we're not represented in Parliament. Never mind that, represented in Parliament. This isn't Parliament who's making these judgments and decisions and rules anyway. It's the ministers, and so they cooked up this scheme to settle that war debt. And there's a long memory, and everybody just saw it coming again. It's going to be corrupt. And, so that's why I think, immediately in 1765, just 2 years after the end of the 7 Years' War, that attempt to raise funds by the Stamp Act, the response was just immediate and overwhelming, and across the board, everybody saying no, and you wonder, well, why were they so geared up for that? Well, it wasn't any. There's no conspiracy there. It was a memory from the 1720s. Is there they go again, and so that's so that was the onset. There's the inception. And really from 1765 to 1775, then you can, step by step, you can follow this all the way through, and it always makes sense. And, and then at a certain point, there's no turning back. In 1774, there's no turning back.
David, I think that's a great point that I'm not sure all of our listeners sometimes realize, is that initially this wasn't about independence at all. This was about the perceived rights of Englishmen and maintaining those rights in the colonies. They weren't against the king. King George was still the monarch, and everybody, for the most part, agreed with that. There were a few rabble-rousers even early on, but initially, particularly when the shot heard around the world and Lexington and Concord occur, this is all about just maintaining and reestablishing the rights of Englishmen in the colonies.
Yeah, well, it's certainly the rhetoric, and I think it's actually the case. And if you follow that back a bit, and I'll just point out that the rhetoric, say in the newspapers in Boston in the 1760s and 70s, the writers, people like John Adams and Samuel Adams, didn't blink, didn't hesitate to go all the way back to Magna Carta in their arguments. So this is seen as it's a global phenomenon, global in the sense of across the government. And interestingly, so the people who settled Concord from Europe in the 1630s brought England with them. So they come over here and they're English and they bring England with them. No question, that's the way it is. But the moment they left, England, starts to change radically. 10 years later, there's a civil war. They didn't plan on that, and so you're over here in the colony saying I'm English, and what being English is changing on the other side, and so that's a really interesting dynamic. But you will see this rhetoric beginning in the 1660s, and some there were some petitions and so following it. It begins right then. It's almost exactly the same argument. And it is, from the side of the government in England, the question that keeps coming up is by what warrant? By what right are you doing this? And the mirror of that image is what's being sent over from this side is. How is this proper government for English for English people? And there's kind of no answer, because it's a moving target. By the time your message gets back to England, the situation's changed. You send a letter. By the time the letter gets there, the king is dead. So so in a way, it's an old story. It's a century-old story, what's being worked out here. When the colonies are established in New England, nobody in England knew how to run a colony. Again, when the English got access to the Mosquito Coast, they didn't know what to do with it. It's a new world, literally. This is a new world, and you see all parties scrambling to catch up, to stay on top of this moving target.
Now, with this moving target, because I like that analogy, we've got the debt building up. We have this memory, the colonial memory, as you put it, of previous debts that had been placed. How are we moving towards the actual explosion into violence, what we're going to see break out on April 19th, 1775?
Right. And that might have been a misstep on the part of the colonists. I think it's not too not too awful to suggest that.
Sure.
Because they knew it at the time, that destroying the tea is basically destroying all the arguments that they were making. You don't destroy private property. That was private property. What's underlying it? That really was a scam on the part of the government in England to support the East India Company, which was having difficulty. Is okay. So here's a way to do it. We'll subsidize these sales, and everything will be Jake. And so they nosed that one out. This is a scam. They knew it was a scam. But they shouldn't have destroyed the tea. I've seen it estimated that it's not unfair to think of the amount of tea destroyed as being worth something like $1 million. I don't know if that's in just in what terms, but this was expensive stuff, and they destroyed it. And so then there's the reaction. The reaction was to close the port of Boston. So from that moment on, and now there's a military governor. General Gage is now military governor in Massachusetts. The port is blockaded. Everybody's out of work. Now things are tough. And when Gage suspended the meeting of the council in 1774, the delegates had already been chosen, and they were all ready to go. They went anyway. Gage said, meeting's off. They went anyway. And in Salem, established this separate government, the provincial Congress, completely extra legal. And that's kind of where that's where it begins. So you look at the minutes of each provincial Congress, and you can see starting in 1774, just about the first order of business is to begin stockpiling supplies for an army of 15,000, an army that's meant to stay in the field. So again, you're not supposed to do that. They're not supposed to be standing armies. That's what this rhetoric through the 17th and 18th century is about. That's the big deal of the Civil War, of the English Civil War. Standing armies. There's your problem. And so what's the provincial Congress doing? They're establishing a standing army. So, but that, and so that's what they're doing. And the provincial Congress then subsequently is meeting in Concord and gathering these supplies, the mountains of stuff, literally tons of this stuff, hogsheads full of wooden spoons and trenching tools and all like that, and the gunpowder and all that. An enormous amount of supplies built up here. Gage knows exactly what's going on. He's got his spy, Church, is telling him what's going on inside the provincial Congress. And so both sides know what the other side is doing, and things just keep going forward. That's why it has a certain inevitability to it, obviously, in retrospect. But I think even if you look at it from the time this was going to happen. Certainly by the time of April 19th, everybody knew it was going to happen. There are some wonderful letters that just really underscore that. The letter from Jonathan Hosmer to a member of his family saying, he says there came up a post to Concord. He's talking about Paul Revere. Revere had ridden alarm to Concord on April 10th. There was a false alarm. Revere rides, that's his job. He rides post. He rode alarm, and they've discovered it's a false alarm. But Jonathan Hosmer says, if they do come out, there will be bloody work. And, how prophetic, because Jonathan Hosmer's son was one of the first two killed at the North Bridge. So everybody knew it was going to happen. Revere knew it was going to happen. That's why he set up that signal the week before. He didn't do it on the day. He set it up the week before. If I don't get across the river, which he knew he was going to do, he knew he was going to ride alarm. If I don't get across here's the backup. Well, the backup worked, and his ride worked, and so following. But it was, as Gage said, a preconcerted action. There is a great deal of planning behind what happened, and a certain amount of making it look like accident after the fact.
Sure.
Which persisted, interestingly, through the 19th century, still comes up, so that every year I get a call from a Boston Globe reporter saying, well, where did it start, Lexington or Concord? The reason there's a fog around that is because they packed a fog around it in 1775. You do not want to be the one who fires first. And that again, is repeated over and over in their internal rhetoric.
Is this the first American cover-up? And then it goes all the way. You start here at Lexington and Concord, and then suddenly it's UFOs and Kennedy, guys. It's a slippery slope as soon as you start to, shroud the truth. So we're talking about, like, they're basically immediately planning a military action or an armed action in 1774.
Yeah.
So we're talking a year prior to the battle we're going to talk about, and then 2 years prior to independence.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
All right. So that's something I think not a lot of people know when they connect, because, obviously the way that a lot of us were taught history growing up was we were just a bunch of farmers that wanted to be left alone, and the evil British came and we said, get out of here. And, we rose up. And that's sort of one of the things that when I talk to my friends who are not super plugged into the history community, that's something that's still with them about this history, is they don't know a lot of the fact that, they were preparing for this. There is a story that backs up a decade, a half a century more, and things like that. So sometimes I like to state the obvious, just because somebody out there listening might not have really connected those dots and understood that, from the moment the provincial Congress starts to meet as the provincial Congress, they are preparing for an inevitable gunfight at some point of sorts. So
they are. I mean, one of the effects of the so New England's got a militia. Every able-bodied male is a member of the militia for from 16 to 60 or something like that.
Are these the Minutemen?
No, Minutemen are actually a little different, but there's a militia. Let's see. Now I got distracted by Minutemen.
Sorry, we're talking about the militia, 16 to 60. I'm the great derailer.
You are that.
But I don't remember why I was bringing up that everybody's a member of the militia. I know that during the militia during the 7 Years' War, as it was conducted in the New World. The council, the Massachusetts Council, the legislative body of government, was responsible for the deployment of the Massachusetts militia. They had a say in where the Massachusetts militia served. So, for instance, they said, no, we're not going to go to Havana, which they were ordered to do. And they said no. So this is something that the council is familiar with, making provision for the deployment of the militia and the supply of the militia and the funding and so following. So in a way, they just picked that right back up in 1774. This is what we've been doing all along. We're going to keep doing that now. And so they are, and they call it an army of observation, but you're not supposed to have an army.
Right, exactly.
Army is different from militia. Regular service is not the same as volunteer service, and that difference gets resolved when the Continental Army is created after Washington takes overall command of the troops. But that's down the line. That hasn't happened yet. Now the minute companies are slightly different. There had been minute companies before. Minute companies they tend to be younger, and they are going to respond in a minute. They're going to, when the alarm comes, they turn right out, drop everything and turn right out. Militia service was fairly light. You turned up for training once a year, maybe twice a year. Starting in 1774 with the establishment of the minute companies are training twice a week. So this is preparation.
They're getting ready.
That's significant. Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's flash forward a little bit to 1775. I think it's 1775. I want to talk specifically about the Boston Massacre because I want to focus on Paul Revere's real famous engraving, the big piece of propaganda that comes out of that, because I think that's something that not a lot of people are aware of as well, and sort of the controversy surrounding how a depiction of the first victim at the Boston Massacre was done. So can we touch on that for a moment?
Right. So the massacre was in 1770.
Oh, I thought that was later. See, this is why I like to do this. I don't know. It's that image, Revere's image, is basically "I told you so." What happens when you put a standing army in a city? Bad things.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened. In 1768, because Boston is they're kind of hotheads. So the resistance to the Stamp Act in 1765, which was repealed almost immediately, they saw, oh, that's a mistake, so let's pull that back. Boston was still fuming, and it was deemed necessary to put troops in Boston just to keep a lid on things. So in 1768, the troops arrive in Boston. Revere also did an engraving of that, the landing of the troops in Boston, because this is huge news. And he's a journalist, so so they're here in 1768. Nobody's happy about it. In part because the army, the British regular army, they're tough guys. These are not nice people, and things do go a bit south, and that's what happened in 1770. Really, a snowball fight gets out of hand, and a bunch of people die.
Yeah. They're being utilized as a policing force primarily there in Boston, aren't they? More of an occupation force.
It's well, I don't know. But police is slightly misleading because that sounds more civic than it is.
Okay.
I would say they're there enforcing. If they're policing anything, they're policing British interests at all times. Like whatever the command says is what they're doing.
Yeah, you could say they're there just in case, okay. But so they have no duties. They have no particular duties. I mean, that's part of the problem. They're just there.
I didn't realize that. Huh?
They're training. They're like that. But they're being housed at the expense of of the Bostonians, so that doesn't go over too well. But it maybe even slightly more basically, it's this thing about a standing army. Armies are supposed to be when you need them, and then they go away. And when armies got in the habit of not going away, it was immediately seen as a problem, and it was a problem. And so that is the problem in 1770. There's a standing army. It makes for a conflict with the civilians, and that's what the massacre was a military civilian conflict. And then the trial, the fact that they were acquitted. That was welcome news, really, on both sides. That we don't have to go to the wall on this one, and maybe things will be all right. And for 4 years, they kind of were all right. But I would say the path from the Bloody Massacre in 1770 to the North Bridge is not as direct as the path from the closing of the port of Boston to the North Bridge. But it's definitely, it's on the route for sure.
So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to ask, because there's a couple things that sort of surround that. And our producer actually had a really good question that this is probably a good time to bring it up. So one of the things I learned in the last couple of years was that in the engraving of the Boston Massacre, the African-American gentleman who was shot was depicted as white. And one of the reasons that that was speculated on to me by the person I was learning this from was that, it was to, in a sense, I'm going to use the word propaganda, but I guess, it is what it is, but maybe to help fan the flames of the movements that are slowly beginning here. So my question to you is, what was the war fever like? How do you gauge that? Because, today we're a nation of 50 states that are never on the same page. And I guess that historically roots itself back to 13 colonies who were seldomly on the same page. So, in 1770, are we already seeing the smoldering of the things that become the revolution? Or is that more, like you said, right around the closing of the port of Boston, when Governor Hutchins is replaced by the military governor, General Gage, and the hammer starts to come down a little bit? Is there a fanning of the flames? And do you have any thoughts on Revere's choice for, why he chose to depict everybody in the picture the way he did instead of, as we know now, obviously the first person shot is, I'm blanking on the name.
Crispus Attucks.
Is there any reason behind that other than to, sort of appeal to the majority?
I'm not sure. But I would suggest that Crispus Attucks' presence there was not as surprising and somehow odd looking as it seems to be to people now. I mean,
sure.
Crispus Attucks worked on he's working down there. He's working on the dock, and was enslaved. May have been enslaved at that point. It's not clear to me anyway. But so he may have been still working for the. Let's see, it was the Brown family. In Framingham. But it could also just be as simple a thing as Attucks is described as light-skinned.
Good point.
It's, we think, this has got to be a great, huge deal to everybody there at the time, and it may have been no deal at all to everybody there at the time.
Sure.
Crispus Attucks is one of those unfortunates who was killed by the militia. That's the thing. And did you know that Paul Revere engraved the silver plaque for Crispus Attucks' coffin?
I did not know that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love little tidbits like that. So
yeah,
between
the bill survives in the Mass Historical.
Oh, very cool. So between this moment and the closing of the port of Boston, do we have the 13? Not even 13 colonies. Do we have New England sort of having this, I don't want to say war fever, but I'm going to use that because it's the only thing I got. So do we have that a kind of push for the sort of the uprising or is that really just from the port of Boston on?
Are the other colonies or even New England seeing this as a Massachusetts problem as opposed to a problem for the rest of them?
In 1770, I guess you could argue that. I mean, it means so the the ideological history of the American Revolution which covers the pamphlet war that's going on, and that certainly goes back to 1765, sure. and it's an unbroken stream. But you would kind of have to look at legislative decisions in every house of the House of Burgesses or the council in Massachusetts or wherever you are, and then and if you do that exercise, I think you're still going to go, well, it's not clear. So there's no inevitability. You don't often. Well, you don't ever see anybody in 1770, I was going out on a limb, but I would say you don't ever see anybody saying we should separate from England. Right. They aren't. They are English, and that's what mattered. We are English. Don't treat us like something that isn't English. Right. That's kind of the, you wouldn't do this to me if I lived in London. Why are you doing this to me because I live in Boston? And in fact, in the Civil War, they did that to people living in London, and that memory is very present there too. That the government is capable of despotic action. No one has any question, and they're aware of they're watching out for it. But I would say there are those who argue that, well, from 1765, it was inevitable, or from 1763, it was inevitable, or 1720, or whatever. They just pick a date, and you can make a case that, yes, revolution had to happen if you do it that way. But from the perspective of 1770, not so hard line, the lines weren't razor sharp. 74, that's a change. And the rest of the colonies immediately at that point said, this is not just Boston's problem, this is our problem.
So that's what I was going to ask. When they closed the port of Boston, are other colonies like, whoa, like not cool?
Yeah, yeah, that was it. That was it. And it made real hardship for Boston. I mean, 3/4 of Boston is now unemployed. Wow. That's what Boston does, is they're shipping stuff in and out. Ports closed, you're out of work. And people are hungry. So the other colonies are actually sending food to Boston to support the people of Boston, not to support any revolutionaries, not to support any shadow government or any shadow army or anything like that. It's just, here is food for the suffering people of Boston. That was the attitude.
The amount of times you just said Boston in the last minute and a half reminds me why I probably don't study this subject so much. I am a New York Yankees fan. We should get that out there right now because I know you're up in the New England area. And I feel like every time I hear the word Boston, my brain just goes, so, so no, are you a big Red Sox fan up there? Are you a baseball guy at all, David?
Sox fan. Well, the Red Sox are my baseball team.
There you go.
All right, that's fair. Interview over. Thanks. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, so okay. So the rest of the colonies are now kind of plugging into this. This isn't just New England or Boston's problem. Colonies like Virginia are paying attention. South Carolina's paying attention. Things like that. And the provincial Congress is meeting. We are stockpiling arms. Now we're definitely having this inevitable conversation. So is this sort of when whatever's left of the brakes start to fail, and now we're streamlining towards the shot heard around the world?
Having just gone through all of this material for our reinstallation here, I would say that's kind of the way it looks to me. From October 1774 to April 19th, 1775, I just don't see how you could deflect that. that played out almost the only way it could. And part of that is, when you stockpile supplies for an army of 15,000, the military governor has to do something about it.
Right.
And almost that whole period from October to April is Gage getting letters from Lord North saying, do something, and Gage writing back, I don't have enough troops. Give me another battleship for
Is this guy related to McClellan? I don't have enough troops.
Enough of that.
It's the McClellan thing, yeah. And finally, just a week before is when Gage gets the letter of no more fooling around, do it. Even though Gage knew it was a mistake. But he got that ultimatum, do it, do something. So he did. And it didn't work out very well.
So you mentioned a little bit ago that, there are eyes in each other's camp, so to speak. Gage has eyes in the Congress and vice versa. So, is the provincial Congress aware that Gage is being pressured to move on them, like almost daily kind of situation? So, one of the things,
and an amazing amount of this stuff appears in the newspapers too. It's like everybody knows all this stuff.
Open secrets. Yeah.
So one of the things,
and there were some letters published illicitly, and Ben Franklin was involved in it and everything. So there's stuff like that going on.
Ben Franklin's a man. Just what a man.
I know. Oh, no kidding. When the depositions that established the provincial argument after April 19th, when the depositions were sent to England, and they were sent with Richard Derby of Salem, who was a fine sailor and had a good schooner. They got there a month before Gage's official report, and they went right to the hands of Ben Franklin, who knew everybody who would want to read these things. So Franklin's the guy.
He's the guy. That's funny. All right. So let's take the brakes off the story ourselves here. Let's get us to April 19th. So one of the last questions I have in this moment is, in getting there, it's obviously, we have eyes in each other's camps. One of the things that I learned recently is that there is reason to suspect that one of the people that betrays the confidence of General Gage is incredibly close to home. Does that come into play really, like, right upon the April date, or is that involved, like, back to the establishment of the provincial Congress? I don't want to betray it yet, but is that a short-sighted thing, or does that play out over a longer period of time?
Yeah, it appears. I mean, it's not really clear, but Gage sent his wife out of the colonies. It does, but it's Benjamin Church is planted in the provincial Congress, which is tragic because Church was on every committee. He knew everything, but he's working for the other side. And then ultimately, out of Gage's papers, that finally became clear only in the 20th century that everybody thought Church was the guy, and he did Scarper and so on, but it was substantiated out of Gage's own papers much later. But it also looks like that the information there's, and I can't quote it, but there are a few bits of information that look like they could only have come from Mrs. Gage to the provincial Congress. I don't.
Wow. What a betrayal, man. What a betrayal. But no, there's a reason for that. And I want to ask you and then potentially speculate. She's an American. She was born in the English colonies of America. She's not.
None of them are Americans.
No, we're all America. No, you're right. Thank you, Matt. She is born in I self-corrected as I was talking, Jabron. She's born in, was it New Jersey? The New Jersey colony?
I don't know that.
Somewhere around that, but she's not from England. She is from on what becomes the United States.
Right.
So is she just straight up loyal, or is there a reason that she potentially betrays him?
There still is no smoking gun. This is still speculation. But there is no question that there was deep inside information getting to the provincials. So Gage knew, for instance, that there were a couple of cannon, bronze cannon in Boston that had been smuggled out of in Concord that had been smuggled out of Boston. Gage knew they were there, and within a day or two of Gage being aware that they were here, the provincial Congress knew that Gage knew they were here, so they were sent out of town. There's this shell game going on that Gage knows where the supplies. So at this point, the supplies are the target. Everybody knows that because it is there are literally tons of this stuff in Concord. It's in every house in Concord. You cannot hide it. But the shell game is going on to hide this stuff. And on the day, ultimately, when they came out, they didn't find much. The stuff had been spirited away.
First, yeah.
And which is amazing because we're talking mountains of material. But that's what they're doing right up until the day itself. As I said, those two cannon were in Groton on the 17th, I think, or the 18th of April. Let's say it's the 17th. The Groton guys knew it, so a few of them came to Concord, going, "Oh, if these are here, then something's happening there." And so there were a few Concord guys at the Groton guys at the North Bridge, although the full company of Groton's. I think Groton had a minute company. They didn't get here until a few days later for the siege of Boston. But so there's secret things, but nothing secret. Gage sent out his spies, and everybody recognized the spies. Right? Hey, there's a spy. It just. It's all this. These are small towns. You can't do this stuff without
everybody knows everybody.
Absolutely. So I don't know that. So there's a bit of that. There's a bit of that going on. Just before. But basically, everybody knows it's going to happen. The question is when. The question's where. It needn't have been Concord. It might have been Worcester. Gage, considered Worcester. That as it turned out, this was the target.
So, is the decision made to actually send out the British column to go find this stuff made sort of in the moment Lord North is like, do it now? Like, is that made? Are we talking weeks? Or are we talking days between
from the time that Gage got the final thing?
Yeah, a couple days. No more questions. Do it. Yeah, days.
Yeah, and he wrote up a draft order within a few days, and then changed the order a little bit on the day itself. The draft order included go arrest Hancock and Adams. That was on their target list. On the 19th, Adams and Hancock are off the list.
That's interesting.
Go get that stuff. So that's what they were doing. They set out to get the stuff.
So when you say Adams, we're talking Sam Adams, right? The beer guy?
Sam, yeah.
So last derail question, because one of the things I always talk about is one of the ways that people connect to history, I think the most, love it or hate it, is through their pop culture, avenues, the things they see in TV and film. And one of the most recent looks we got at this subject matter was through the History Channel Sons of Liberty series, where Sam Adams got turned into a ninja Jedi master somehow. And Paul Revere
never did good.
Yeah, Paul Revere never did anything wrong in his life. But, so one of the things that I thought was interesting was when you said spirited away. So when they're moving the stuff out of these areas, one of the things they showed in that show was that they weren't really moving them out. They were burying them in the ground. And So that's one of the things I want to be clear about is like there was a whole lot of clandestine stuff happening. Obviously, a lot of secrets were out in the open, but there wasn't this like crazy, like we're going to trick the British by burying our guns in our crop fields, like everywhere we looked. And like, there wasn't this moment where they found a single musket ball and they were like, oh, it's on. Like there's a lot of that stuff that'll mislead you. But I always want to tell people, like, if you're listening to what we're talking about and the story is familiar to you, you likely saw it on the History Channel recently. But here's how it really played out, y'all. So.
Well, that thing about, plowing the stuff into the fields and so on, I'm pretty sure is a 19th century tale told about Barrett's farm, specifically James Barrett's farm. And there was a lot of stuff out there, including those 2 bronze cannon for a while, but they weren't there on the day. That story is told in a couple of variants, but generally not told before 1835. And it's not especially plausible.
Right.
Usually the one about we put the muskets in the furrows where there weren't a lot of muskets in play. Well, I shouldn't say that, but the Provincial Congress was not stockpiling long arms. There was other ammunition, you bet, gunpowder, bullets, cannonball, yes, all that, but long arms, no. They're not
you were already
buying them.
required to have them.
Because these are volunteer militias. We'll get to the Minute Company in a second because they're different. But yes, the militia, you are supposed to turn up armed and equipped according to law.
Right.
You're carrying your own arms, and we have some in our collection here that demonstrate that wonderfully. Here's a Fowler. This is for shooting ducks, and it's got a bayonet lug on it. Huh. Why do you need a bayonet when you're shooting ducks? Well, you don't.
In case the ducks charge you.
Well, Canada geese are pretty aggressive.
They charge when wounded. It's true. So, yep. But that was because the militia arms themselves. Right. And so you convert your domestic Fowler into a military arm by putting a bayonet lug on it. And it happened, as I said, we've got an example. But the Minute Companies were a little different, a little outside of the militia structure, established specifically there had been Minute Companies before, but they're established by Provincial Congress. And those guys needed arms. So there was a general muster in March of 1774 where all the towns mustered their militia and minute companies on the same day. And part of that was to count noses and count muskets and who's come up missing. And Concord found that, 4 or 5 guys needed muskets. So then they acquire the muskets to arm these guys. But there aren't stands of arms being stored with these mountains of materials that I'm talking about here. Long arms aren't really part of that. So the story about burying them in the furrows at Barrett's mill, that works out pretty good because they would fit in a furrow, but there are no muskets to bury.
I found, David, that the longer you wait to tell a story, the bigger the fish gets. And so it's best that you just, 1830, we buried them everywhere. The British were so dumb they couldn't find them. Like, just wait.
There are a lot of those stories of the clever Yankee outwitting the redbacks.
And it happens 80 or so years later. The clever Yankees strike again.
Right.
God.
Exactly.
And then the clever Yankees all through the 20th century. Home run reference. Sorry. Anyway, sorry. That was so bad. That was a pretty bad joke.
Nobody remembers 1927. I'm sorry.
Nobody, especially not anybody in Boston. No. Murderers Row Yankees.
So, David, General Gage is gotten this order to do something, and he's now going to do it. And he's very concerned about the number of troops he has, and he doesn't believe he has enough troops, but he is still going to put a fairly sizable force into the field to head up there to to deal with all these materials. Like you said, there's a lot of material that they're going after. He's going to put Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, I understand, in charge of this column, and they're going to have what, in the neighborhood of 700-ish redcoats?
700, 800, yeah.
Okay.
Between 700 and 800. It's a little mushy.
Right, but a sizable force nonetheless.
Yeah, this was a big expedition. It was meant to be lightning. Nobody was supposed to know. They were supposed to be out there, do the job, and be back by the end of the day, and basically nobody was supposed to notice. It didn't work out that way. And part of the problem may very well have been a command and control problem, which the regulars genuinely had all day. So let's say there's 700 of them. These are companies of light infantry and grenadiers.
Right.
So you take the grenadier company and the light infantry company from this regiment, grenadier and light infantry from this regiment, stick them together. Well, those guys don't have their regular officers now. And these are barely manageable people. And so not having their regular officers made a difference on the day. As I said, command and control problems. At a certain point, the regular officers literally confronted their own men with bayonets and told them to turn around. You know, that's not supposed to happen. So there were difficulties and maybe, you know, structural difficulties that go back to that. If you pluck these companies from all the different regiments, you're going to have problems out in the field, and they did. And there were problems with orders. Percy's Relief Company got orders, and they were left on in the tent of a guy who had ridden out on with Smith. So he never got the order. And you know, it's things like that that are going wrong. And the regulars. You know, the signal that Revere sent was by land or by sea. By sea, what he meant was across the Charles River. Right. And that's what they did. The regulars crossed the Charles, that's what Revere did too, but the regulars crossed the Charles River to Lechmere, which means the swamp of blood-sucking worms. That's where you're going, guys.
I love heavy metal. This is the best part of the show so far. We're talking about blood-sucking worms. Let's go.
Lechmere.
Yes.
So they get to Lechmere and they are stuck there for hours. Wow. By just little, you know, logistical mistakes. You know, they gave them food that they didn't want. They're throwing the food away. Everybody's boots are wet, all this stuff. They're standing there. Meanwhile, this signal that Revere had set up, this signal that Revere himself carried, is moving out at 7 miles an hour, just like this. Move at 7 miles an hour in every direction, because it's not just Revere and Dawes and Prescott. There's other alarm riders out there, no question. So the alarm's going out like this, and as the alarm goes out, the troops from whatever town that get the alarm, they come in at 3 miles an hour. It's like that all day. Goes out at 7 miles, come in at 3 miles. And when they come in, wherever they're coming from, Framingham, Danvers, wherever they're coming from, the provincials hit the regular column exactly where it is, over and over and over again, all day. And this is Gage's, you know, frustration. You can't have this many people assemble. You can't have them all in the right place unless you planned it. And meanwhile, the provincials are going, no, we didn't plan it. It just, you know, these things happen.
Yeah. Sure, you're right.
No, the alarm was beautiful, functioned beautifully. And you just have to imagine a cloud of alarm riders all over the countryside all day, because the communication, enormous amount of communication to get this thing to happen, completely unrecorded. It's not recorded anywhere. Revere actually tips his hand a little bit in his deposition, which was not sent, by the way. But Revere said, I set this up the week before with the militia in Charlestown. So why did you set up a signal a week before if you didn't know this was going to happen?
Is this what? I didn't say that. You misheard
luck?
me.
Was this just luck?
Yeah, you're misquoting.
Yeah, I set up signals with everybody just in case.
Just in case. So this is the famous Old North Church, right? We're talking about the famous lanterns, like you said, if by sea or by land, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. Now, when you said 7 miles an hour, is that the speed of a horse? You said the message is leaving.
No, I calculated. I just did the math, and it looks like the signal was traveling at 7 miles an hour because the local local histories all around here record in the 19th century. We got the alarm at 8 o'clock in the morning. We got the alarm at 4 o'clock in the morning. We got the alarm at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Whenever it happened, they record it. So you can do it. You can figure it out.
So I'm not a math guy, and that's an exercise I've probably never even thought about because I'm not a math guy, but that's an awesome piece of information. So if you're like super analytical, start looking at timestamps. Like that's something I think the first time I thought about timestamps in history was recently when you and I were discussing daylight savings time and the Titanic.
Oh, sure.
We were discussing a timestamp on a telegram in relation to what we know about. So short is the Outer Banks of North Carolina gets one of the first of the CQD messages, and they mark it at 11:25. But the ship hits the iceberg at 11:40, and so we were trying to figure that out. And so I was doing all these math exercises. Now I've done my second one. Thanks, David. I appreciate that.
Sweet. Yeah. Now, if you got to know blockchains, you got to know timestamps. If you're going to be dealing in NFTs, I'm sure you're up to that, huh?
All right, Matt, you got to start amend Wildman to mathematician.
There you go.
During my intro,
I can do that.
So, all right. So what time does the column leave Boston? Like is they leave in the morning of the 19th? It's not like an overnight from the 18th into the 19th. Is it just?
No, it's overnight. So it's 10 o'clock at night on the 18th.
Okay.
But they don't get moving until I want to say 5 or 6 hours later.
Okay.
So they got across the river, and then they just stood there for
Getting
hours.
Sucked on by leeches.
Lovely.
Yep. And and meanwhile the alarm is spreading. So Revere is in Lexington by midnight, even though he was he was deflected initially, almost captured.
Mm-hmm.
Made it to Lexington, moved on to Concord, was captured, talked his way out of it, amazingly. A guy was holding a pistol to his breast and said, if you lie, maybe he was holding it to his head. He said, if you lie, I'll blow your brains out. And so the next thing Revere did was lie.
Yes.
He told the guy, you're surrounded. They could hear the alarm guns going. So you can imagine there are church bells ringing in the countryside, 3 o'clock in the morning. There are alarm guns firing. So nobody's out shooting ducks. Nobody's
praying. Nobody's in church right now.
And so they know that the game is up. They know that they've been spotted.
I was going to say, so the British are marching into this, hearing all of this, like, so we're not a secret anymore.
Yep. And cool. So Revere gets captured. They hear the alarm guns, and they ask Revere, what's that about? He said, you're surrounded. There are 500 men surrounding you. And they believed him. And so they let him go. And so Revere, instead of going home to bed as a sensible person might, he went right back to Lexington, right back to Buckman's Tavern, picked up a big trunk of John Hancock's correspondence. So we can imagine this is John Hancock's notes from he's president of the Provincial Congress. Probably that's what's in the trunk. Revere picks this thing up and takes it out of Buckman Tavern and was crossing the common with this box when the firing started.
Whoa.
That's the kind of guy Revere is.
Wow. All right.
And just absolutely amazing. But that, again, that's the efficacy of of the signal. This is a good reason to hire Paul Revere to write alarm for you. He does a good job.
Sure. So, all right. So let's get to, the Tavern Green, and the famous, shot heard around the world and all that. So the British, my understanding is that, when the Minutemen, the militia, the roughly less than 100 guys, I don't want to describe them incorrectly. I'll let you put the right label on them. But when the less than 100 guys or so form loosely across the green, they're basically told to let them by, don't shoot at them and things like that. And the British, you would think, if they're just going after these weapons, they would just go right by these guys. But that's not exactly what happens. It seems like they go right for them. They just deploy right into the green. So take it from there. Sort of the British, like, we're starting to have actual armed forces now squaring on each other. We have this sort of standoff about to occur. Tell our listeners a little bit about the decision, maybe not so much the decision itself, but the fact that the British don't just keep marching, that they see this and they go, okay, it's on.
Yeah. And that looks like one of those command and control things too. It shouldn't have happened. But the Lexington didn't have a minute company. They had a militia company, and there's 60 of them. And so when Revere gets to Lexington at midnight, and they ring the bell, and that's the signal for the militia to muster, and they did. So they muster on the common, which is that's where they would train normally. So they muster there. Parker, captain of the Lexington company, waits with him for a while. Nothing happens because you remember the regulars are still stuck in the swamp at Lechmere. Right. They're not moving. And so maybe this is another false alarm. There'd been a few. Parker says, okay, go home if you live right here. If you don't live right here, go to the Buckman Tavern and wait until you hear the drum. So that's what they do. They wait. And then just around dawn, the drum, that's William Diamond. William Diamond beats the tattoo. They muster again on the common, on the green in Lexington. And then the regulars do show up finally.
This comes down to the last scout. Pardon me for interrupting, but doesn't this come down to like the last scout that's sent out? Like, people are being sent out to scout and coming back and like nothing. And then it's like the last guy that gets sent out comes in at a full gallop and is like, no, they're moving. Like, they're definitely coming.
It was something like, something like that.
I know it was 11th hour, like about something at 11th hour was sticking out to me. And like, you just wonder what happens if they go home. There's enough. Let's say the last guy comes back and says nothing, and then they go home, and then the British show up.
I think it was close. So the Lexington was not their target anymore.
Right.
Hancock and Adams are not on the list anymore. They should have just gone right through Lexington to Concord, but here they are confronted by armed militia. And it was actually it's Major Pitcairn took a company over to convince John Parker to go away. And what they were ordering was, lay down your arms and go away. And the militia did not lay down their arms. They were dispersing, but they didn't lay down their arms. And then something happened. So Revere, you remember Revere is right there. He's cutting through these guys with the most treasonous batch of papers you could possibly touch. And he heard what he thought was a pistol shot. And that started it. Now, a pistol, Revere would know this too, pistol means officer, and not a provincial officer. The provincial officers generally are not carrying pistols. But that's the way Revere reported it. I heard a pistol shot. And then a ragged firing began. and they couldn't stop it. So they're trying to tell them stop shooting, and they wouldn't. So they kept shooting, and then they gave 3 cheers at the end.
Bastards.
Insulting. And then they went back to the rest of the column. So there were about 100 who'd hived out from the column, confronted Parker, fired on them, killed, I should know this number, I think 7.
It sounds right.
I have between 7 and 8 between the places I look for this number too.
And that, when you consider there's only 60 in this company, that's huge. 10% fatality.
Decimated.
That is decimation. That's World War I. That's Civil War. That's awful. And actually, Parker rallied. Those guys were out in the field again in the afternoon. They,
so this is is Parker the one that gets attributed with the famous, let them by, don't shoot, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. Is that his quote?
It's attributed to him. Yeah. I think that's 19th century.
More apocryphal. Yeah.
But I believe Parker's order was don't fire. That was everybody's order on the provincial side. Don't fire first. They all got that word. They all got that word. Don't fire first. And they didn't. So the regulars fire and then move on.
So is there an immediate tactical situation, like withdrawal, like where the provincials start moving immediately back to Concord and the bridge, or there's a several hour layover between these?
Well, there's no pause. The alarm's gone out. Troops are coming in. There's, depending on what time of day we're saying this is, let's say it's 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. It's just about dawn, the firing at Lexington. But Concord had heard about it at 2 o'clock in the morning. And Concord's 2 militia companies and 2-minute companies muster in the center of town. Lincoln shows up because Lincoln got the word around 3 o'clock in the morning. So Lincoln's here, Acton's here, and they move up above they're maneuvering in town, thinking about it. They were thinking about, let's go out and confront the column. And here's where that same story. Reuben Brown, who's a saddler, who lives right in the center of town, rode out toward Lexington to see what was going on, saw or heard the firing, and came back and reported that. He couldn't report if anyone was killed. He couldn't report even if they were firing live ammunition. He suggested that maybe it was not live ammunition. He didn't know, but they know there's firing. And so they're getting ready. And then, so the provincial forces in Concord do march out the Lexington Road. This is a man in David Brown's company who reported this 50 years later. They march out, see the column, turn around because the column outnumbers them 5 to 1. Right. They turn around and march back into Concord, both playing fifes and drums. So both of them are playing. We had grand music, Amos Barrett said. So that's the beginning. Is the column of provincials goes out, sees the column of regulars, turns around, comes back, and then there's this maneuvering going on. So the provincials end up near the North Bridge. There's a hill there, Punkatasset. You can see, remember, there's not tree one. There are no trees at this point in New England. So
is that because Maine's cutting them all down for their lumber?
Well, Maine
I think yet. That's what it was.
Well, I just joke because our producer's from Brewer, Maine, and he always talks about lobster and lumber. He's the most cliche Mainer I've ever met in my life. thinks everything was invented in Maine. But no, I ask because I do know that, the region of Maine that becomes the state, it's part of the Massachusetts colony at this time, but it is, I know it's famous for its lumber. So is that
forested? Yeah.
Is that because it's elsewhere that stuff is happening?
This area is not forested. It hadn't been since the 17th century. If you don't cut it down to put in a field, you cut it down to burn firewood. So there's no trees. You can see they're out there observing above the North Bridge. So about 10 o'clock in the morning, there's about 450 provincial troops there. And there are a couple of companies guarding the North Bridge. So when the regulars get into town, which they do about 7 o'clock in the morning, and they take over the Wright Tavern, which is where the provincials had just been, their coffee's probably still warm on the bar. And Smith sends he sends three companies out to James Barrett's farm to get what's there, 3 companies to the North Bridge to hold the bridge, 3 companies to the South Bridge to hold that bridge, and everybody else is looking for supplies in Concord. That's what's going on. But, out at the North Bridge, the provincials who are there can see the center of town, and they see smoke rising because what the regulars are doing is burning the stuff that they find, piling up gun carriages and entrenching tools and setting them on fire right next to the townhouse, which has gunpowder in it. And
very smart. OSHA safe.
So they see the smoke from the North Bridge and think they're burning the town down, and said, "Now let's go back into town." So that's when they make the move to cross that bridge, to cross the North Bridge. The provincials are crossing the North Bridge, and the regulars are going to stop them. So before they do that, one of my favorite passages is they change their flints. The provincials, as they're mustering in the field above the bridge, change their flints. You change your flints so the next time you pull the trigger, you get lots and lots of sparks.
Yeah.
And they're doing that in, I wouldn't say full view, but pretty unobstructed view of the regulars. So they are just, I'm changing my flint here,
Yes.
What can go wrong? And then minutes later, marched down to the bridge and took fire. It really is amazing, but there's no question about commitment at this point. They're in. So they were going to come back into town to, don't burn the town down. But they're confronted by the regulars, who fire warning shots into the river and then fire on the provincials and kill 2, including Abner Hosmer, who I mentioned, the son of the man who wrote that prophetic letter on the 10th. Really, really quite amazing. And then the regulars go back into Concord, mill around again. They spend a lot of time milling around. And then finally leave town around noon, headed back to Boston. But they are pursued from that moment on. They're fired on from Merriam's Corner, quarter mile from the center of town, half a mile from the center of town. There's an encircling fire around them for the whole rest of the day. It was a very long day. And meanwhile, as I said, the troops are coming in from all over. 26 communities had minute or militia troops in the field by the end of the day. So everybody's turning out.
Now, David,
and as I said, as they arrive, they hit the column right where the column is. And so that was the rest of the day. Percy, as I said, now Percy's orders to send a relief column out had been delayed, was put on the wrong bed, and finally Percy sets out and is able to relieve the retreat, not retreating, it's not a retreat, they're just going back to Boston. They relieve that column at Lexington in the just past noon, 1 o'clock or so. And that's kind of what saves them, because if without Percy's relief, and he had 2 cannon with him, and that's a game changer when you've got cannon. So that's how they managed to get back to Boston at all, is they got Percy's relief. But it was awful. And again, there's 800 of them, 1,500 of them if you count Percy's troops, and they had 243 casualties, which is a big number. So this is it's a bad day. You've been marching now for 20 hours, no food, wet shoes, and they started to snap. I mean, they almost just kind of fell apart. It was really that close. That's when they were confronted by their own officers at bayonet point. Things were not good in the afternoon, and there's a great deal of malice about the fighting in Arlington, monotony it was called then, on the part of the regulars. It's pretty clear they were frenzied by the end of the day. It was just not good.
Now, David, the column, like you said, is made up of grenadier companies and light companies. Do we see any effort by the Crown Forces, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, to utilize his light companies as they should be utilized to deal with these clouds of men?
They're flankers. Yeah, the light infantry's flankers all the way along. And that was a trick that the regulars had to learn woefully. They got outflanked a few times. But yeah, you can see them in the Doolittle. There's flankers out all the time. Yeah, all the time.
Great. There's a lot of American mythology that comes out of this series of engagements as well. The idea of the Minuteman and knocking back these regular forces, and the whole idea of winning a war, or at least in this case, winning a couple of engagements, hiding behind rocks and trees, and this is how we really should be fighting our wars. And being a primarily 19th century historian, I deal with this a lot when it comes to the American Civil War. Well, why are we fighting in linear warfare as opposed to hiding behind rocks and trees like our forefathers did? I attribute a lot of that mythology to these fights. Do you think that's fair, or do you see that coming from elsewhere?
Part of that, that's not the way you're supposed to conduct a war.
Exactly.
That was offensive to even just regular troops, British, just privates. There are a couple of letters that say, these skulking dogs are hiding behind rocks. That's not how you do it. You stand up there. Right. That's what Washington did. You stand there. There's a wonderful phrase, actually, that Amos Barrett says about the North Bridge. Their balls whistled well. And this is kind of a conventional saying. Washington used exactly the same phrase in his journal, talking about 1756. But what that means is a musket ball is this close to your ear.
Right.
To whistle well, this is how close they are. And that means I stood there. That's what you're supposed to do. And Washington did that. He did that. They kept saying, don't do that. But
which is so weird, because he was involved in the French and Indian War, and he saw what was known as Indian fighting and stuff like that with, the assistance of all the indigenous peoples and how they fought. So, the stand up and fight thing is, of course it's how we're supposed to do things, but it can't be that foreign. We literally just participated in some different stuff.
Stand up and fight in the 18th century is the only way you're going to get a resolution where the politicians can sit down and pound out a treaty. Conducting war is changing. I mean, they're probably. I'm sure that Caesar has something to say about you're fighting like a Yugoslavian,
Classic
you're supposed
Caesar.
to stand there. So there is this. this matter of military culture actually enters into the events of the day itself, and that's kind of one of those. So you will see this complaint, but where they're saying, they're not fighting right. But Gage, not Gage, Percy, Lord Percy, who is, he's the richest man in England, but he's also, England's top soldier at that day. And he says, these guys are good. Anybody who thinks that they're, not is making a mistake. And he said that on April 19th, at the end of the day, that, he saw what was going on because they had been training. They're using the British training manuals. They wanted to fight like that. But you need a different structure. You need a different army. You remember these supplies, they hadn't deployed those supplies yet.
Right.
This is still a militia. And so that, so some of those questions, but that thing about, fighting behind and where did that come from? There are Ranger companies in during the 7 years, the conduct of the 7 Years' War. There are Ranger companies, and you can trace continuities through there. Same individuals sometimes. Sometimes you can follow them through their powder horns, which is interesting. But so that Ranger idea is there. And all these things that, taking advantage of the terrain, I forget the acronym, but there's a 4-letter one. That's what you do. You take advantage of the terrain. That's modern tactic. But the other one, and as you were saying about the Civil War, here they are using, it's Napoleonic tactics, but you've got pre-World War I armament. It went badly. Yeah. So it is this. It's this transitional era. How do you conduct a war? It's not entirely clear, and you do see grousing about. It's mostly that's the cowardly way to do it, and so you probably won't find provincials saying, no, we did it the right way. We hid behind stone walls. They would probably say, I didn't hide behind any stone wall. And they didn't actually. Smith says this. Is it Smith? I think it is Smith who says this. He saw men step into the road and fire at the regular officers, even though, he said, they were morally certain that they would be instantly killed. So morally certain means absolutely certain. This is Kant uses the phrase. It's as true as it's possible to get as a human. Morally certain. So here are people, and they saw them, provincials, who stepped into the road, fired, and knew they were going to be killed instantly. And still they did it. So that I would put that as a counter to hiding behind rocks and trees. Certainly. You got a rock and tree, hide behind it, by the way.
Yes, of course. No, I'm no dummy. But they did this, I think it's described as sort of a running gun battle. Obviously, it's not a retreat. The British are just withdrawing back into the city.
Yeah. Mission accomplished. We're going home.
This goes on for like 6 hours, right?
It is. It's awful. Yep.
I would be
7 o'clock at night.
Wrecked. Yeah.
7 o'clock at night by the time they get back to not Lechmere, but get back to Charlestown.
Don't they make a decision? In fact, I'm glad you mentioned that because aren't they initially heading for Boston and then at the last second they kind of go, nope, Charlestown.
Yeah, and that was the right move because the bridge they were going to cross had been compromised.
Right.
Oh, okay.
So, all right. Well, the shot heard round the world sets us on a path that we are not coming back from at this point. There were literal bullets flying, and we have begun a year plus worth of fighting before we even declare independence. What I'd like to do is have you back in a couple weeks to talk about the Siege of Boston so we can kind of wrap up this whole moment because the Siege of Boston begins immediately. Like the story doesn't, there's no, I asked earlier, was there a lull, like a layover in time? And the answer was no. Things kind of go right from Lexington to Concord. Well, when this is all over, the Siege of Boston has begun. And
the siege of Boston is reasonably said to begin on April 19th. By April 20th, April 21st, there are an estimated 20,000 provincial troops surrounding Boston.
That was one of the things I wanted to mention.
That same alarm. It's that same alarm still functioning.
So as Lexington and Concord are happening, it's still going out.
It is still going out. It's you can just follow it. It's down in Connecticut by here. It's down. And it's Revere who's doing it too. Revere carries the news to Pennsylvania.
Oh my goodness.
Philadelphia.
One of the things that I thought was fascinating while Matt and I were doing some of the prep work was that, when you get into the battles, Lexington, I like that we call it a battle. It's basically a skirmish that's over super fast. But between these two battles, we're talking about like 60, 70 guys. And then there's like 400 guys for the provincials. And then, we have a column that's like 800 guys, 400 at Lexington, and things like that. And then by the end of this day, we have almost 4,000 provincials immediately in the vicinity. The relief column that comes up, I think Percy's relief column is equally as large as Smith's column, if not bigger, because they have almost 2,000 guys as they're sort of finishing what they're doing. And then you say, within a day and a half, 2 days, there's 20,000 provincials.
Gage was right. He didn't have enough troops.
I guess, I'm not going to make another McClellan joke. That would be a forced one. But it's amazing how much this just swelled so quickly. So if we could get you back in a couple of weeks, I'd like to talk about the siege of Boston and just sort of how we really get into what is the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War as we understand it. Because I think a lot of people are of the Ron Swanson of Parks and Rec's mindset that nothing existed before July 4th, 1776. So, I want to make sure that we can connect a little bit more to how we get to independence and things like that. So,
don't ask me to contradict Ron Swanson.
Oh, well, of course, he is the law. Absolutely here. David, any final words before we get out of here for the day, buddy?
No, I appreciate talking with you.
This has been a blast. Thank you so much. Sir. All right, look. So, everybody, we thank you all for hanging out with the History Things podcast. As always, follow us on social media. Actually, let's start with you, David. How can we engage with the museum if we can't make it to Concord ourselves?
We have a website, Concord Museum. It should pop right up, and it includes a microsite dedicated to April 19th. You can search our collections management database for our April 19th objects. We have the best collection of things that were there on the day, and so on. So a lot of our resources are at our website.
Fantastic. Awesome. So make sure you get online. Make sure you use your Googles, your Yahoos, your Bing, if you're one of those weirdos that uses that search engine. But make sure you search for the Concord Museum. And if you can get up there, please do it. We like to support these sites in person and everything like that. If you want to follow along with what we're doing here on the History Things podcast, as weird as it gets sometimes, make sure you follow us on our social media, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram at the History Things podcast. If you want to follow our buddy Matt here directly, you can follow him at Matt Borders on Instagram. You can follow me and all my weird insanity over at History Things with Pat on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram as well. I had a lot of fun today. I learned a lot. This is obviously a subject that I make no bones about. I know enough to be dangerous to the layman, but when I talk to the real heavy hitters, I am all ears. And David, today I was all ears, despite how much I talk. I know this, guys. I'm Irish. Let's let it go here. But I learned a lot from you, and I'm very humbled and very grateful. So thank you, so much for spending time with us. For the History Things podcast, I'm your co-host, Pat McGuire. This has been my co-host, Matt Borders. For our guest here, David Wood, we are saying see you later.
Have a good night.
On Facebook and Instagram at the History Things Podcast for all the latest news and exclusives. Make sure to also follow Pat and Matt on their social medias at History Things with Pat and at Matt Borders Books. Have a question, comment, or compliment for the show? Send us an email at historythingspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show.